The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The walls are closing in as the special counsel investigation enters a second year. But are those walls closing in on President Trump or the swamp dwellers intent on taking him down? Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com. And this week we'll drill down on the increasingly apparent attempts by deep state operatives in the Obama administration to infiltrate the Trump presidential campaign and administration. Mark Angelides of LibertyNation.com will join us to explain the many things we've discovered just in the last week, which are chronicled in his two-part series entitled Bringing Down a President. The president attacks murderous gangs of illegal immigrants, and Democrats defend them. Seriously. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza joins us to discuss the Supreme Court giving the green light to sports gambling across the nation.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
But we commence the proceedings with our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out some of the most wacky, astonishing, and damnable things uttered by politicians and the chattering class on the events and issues of the day. So where is Robert Mueller headed with his special counsel investigation? We're now into a second year, and the heat has been turned up on the Mueller team to wrap things up and get out of Dodge, particularly by the attack dog hired to fight the public battle for the Trump legal team, Rudy Giuliani, who promised on Fox News that they're not going to roll over.
I think that they have the facts from which they can write their report. If you're going to write a fair report, fine, write it. If you're going to write an unfair report, write it, and we will combat it. We're ready to rip it apart, and we're ready to rip them apart if that's what they want.
Now, we're finding out more on a daily basis about the events and people involved in launching this special counsel investigation. We published a detailed two-part series this week on LibertyNation.com on how this likely all went down, and the man who authored it, Mark Angelides, will join us in the next segment. But we have now reached a point in our national politics where Democrats are so addled by hatred for President Trump that they are actually defending barbaric gangs of illegal immigrant murderers. This week at a meeting in California with officials opposed to that state's sanctuary policy of embracing all illegal immigrants at all times, Trump was asked about MS-13 gangs, which take murder to a whole new level.
We're taking people out of the country. You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people. These are animals. And we're taking them out of the country at a level and at a rate that's never happened before. And because of the weak laws, they come in fast. We get them, we release them, we get them again, we bring them out. It's crazy. The dumbest laws on immigration in the world.
So the president calls the people in MS-13 gangs, mostly from El Salvador, animals. Not far off, considering the unspeakably cruel methods they use to murdering mostly poor immigrants. Their motto is kill, rape, control. And they stop at nothing to brutalize their victims, often using machetes to hack their victims to death. In one case, beating a woman to death with 28 blows with a baseball bat. But while the president was referring only to MS-13 criminals, Nancy Pelosi went public telling a bold-faced lie by saying Trump was calling all illegal immigrants animals when she damn well knew he was referring only to MS-13.
We're all God's children. There's a spark of divinity in every person on earth, and that we all have to recognize that as we respect the dignity and worth of every person. And so when the President of the United States says about undocumented immigrants, these aren't people, these are animals, you have to wonder, does he not believe in the spark of divinity, the dignity and worth of every person?
So this is what it's come to. The Democrat leader in the United States House of Representatives, so disfigured by hatred for Trump, publicly telling an obvious, bold-faced lie and using fake piety to defend gangs of murderous illegal immigrants. If you're like me, I'm sure you'd never thought you'd see this day. But here we are. And as the 2018 midterm elections loom in the not-so-distant future, now less than 6 months away, you have to think Pelosi and her fellow travelers on the far left, including, of course, the elite media, are going so far as defending MS-13 because their voters have moved so far to the left. Both parties have been holding primaries for a number of Senate and House seats in recent days. Republicans generally happy with the winners of a bunch of recent primaries that were won by candidates considered quite electable. The Democrats more of a mixed bag, some conventional Hillary Clinton-style liberals winning primaries, some Pelosi acolytes and Bernie Sanders-style progressives winning others. But to understand the heart of the current Democrat Party, listen to Jeff Weaver, campaign manager for Bernie, describing just how far to the left the Democrats have moved.
You know, when Bernie started, he was at 3%, 4%, 5%. And he was talking about things like free public college. He was talking about universal health care. He was talking about $15 minimum wage. Well, those are all, you know, basically articles of faith in the Democratic Party now. And they were considered sort of out on the fringe at the beginning of that campaign.
So the Democrats are in something of a quandary, knowing that their base is increasingly left-wing, but that more moderate Democrats like Conor Lamb, the Democrat who won in a special election recently in a district in Pennsylvania that Trump won big, those guys are more electable. So in the end, the question is whether they can fulfill their ultimate goal to win the 24 seats they need to take control of the House with no agenda beyond opposing all things Trump. Because up to now, at least, they have failed to come up with anything resembling a positive agenda. Now, this becomes even more perilous for the Democrats when the likes of Mad Maxine Waters, the uber-left congresswoman from California, keeps running her mouth and is actually taken seriously by leftist media outlets like MSNBC. Listen to Mad Max dressing down a fellow member of Congress on the House floor who deigned to speak in support of President Trump.
This business about making America great again, it is your president that's dividing this country. And don't talk to me about the fact that we don't understand what happens on the automobile. No, I will not yield.
The chair wishes to remind all members that they are to address their remarks to the chair.
I resent the remark about making America great again. He's down here making a speech for this dishonorable president of the United States of America. Having said that, I reserve the balance of my time. And no, yield? I do not yield not 1 second to you. Not 1 second.
Do the Democrats actually believe that Nancy Pelosi and her fellow travelers defending MS-13 gangs and Maxine Waters making a spectacle of herself is going to convince Americans to turn over control of the House to them? Really? But not all of the aid and comfort the left is getting these days is coming from the leftist media. They can count on the unrelentingly never-Trump so-called conservatives like George Will to help them out. Here's George Will with his new friends at far-left MSNBC.
Donald Trump is an open book who's been reading himself to the country for 30 years. There are just no mysteries left. And he is this, as I said, this jumble of insecurities and partially or not at all really compensating vanities. He's a kind of mistake of nature.
As George Will now moves comfortably into the embrace of the far left, while President Trump enacts an agenda of the very things these never-Trump Republicans and conservatives like him claim to support, you'll wonder which is worse, that Mr. Will doesn't even realize he's so obviously being played as a useful idiot by the left, or that he knows it but doesn't care. Now, maybe even he doesn't know, because like the left, George Will and his fellow never-Trumpers like Bill Kristol and Joe Scarborough and on, are suffering from terminal cases of TDS, Trump Derangement Syndrome. At Liberty Nation, we never stop trying to make things more convenient for our busy audience. That's why we've developed a new, faster, and more intuitive app. Simply download the LibertyNation.com app from Apple iTunes or the Google Play Store. Liberty Nation stays on top of the latest news and developments, and now you can too. Next up, bringing down a president.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We believe that all men are entitled to blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Bringing down a president. That's the title of an important and heavily viewed two-part series on LibertyNation.com this week. Breaking open, connecting the dots, pulling together the pieces on how the deep state likely set up and infiltrated the Trump campaign, how a young, low-level operative in the campaign took the bait, and how that ultimately provided the basis for the special counsel investigation that has now entered its second year. The writer and dot connector is Mark Angelides, who joins us now from London. And Mark, welcome. And let's start with a word about the viability of this scenario, this plot to set up the Trump campaign and presidency that you outline in your two-part series. How much of this is based on proven facts? How much on educated guesses? And how much on sort of connect the dots logic?
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me. Well, it kind of works out that everything that I put into the two-piece article is a single point, which is based on a verifiable, proven fact. But then what I've done is I've made a theory around those facts. And the uncomfortable thing is that the theory fits perfectly well.
Okay, so this is a complicated scenario, which seems to be the intent of it. Set the scene for us. How was George Papadopoulos of the Trump campaign set up as a patsy? And how did it all ultimately lead to the special counsel investigation by Robert Mueller?
Okay, well, I mean, if you've ever seen The Sting, then you've pretty much got the plot. So what happened was, in my opinion, is that you have three parts to this. You have three different people who are there to set the scene for everything. So you have the setter, the verifier, and the witness. Now, the setter is somebody that will basically get the ball rolling. The verifier is to act as a third party to say, well, actually, yes, this is what I saw. And then there's the witness, who's a very, very important one here, because it's got to be somebody who's in an unimpeachable position. So what happened was George Papadopoulos was met by a chap called Joseph Mifsud, who has now gone missing, and whose background, which I will be covering in an article soon enough, seems to be almost pulled out of the air. That there's no real verifiable links of him ever actually existing. And so he planted the idea with Papadopoulos that there was something to do with Russians and emails. And then fast forward a little while, then you have the verifier, the second part of this, who in my theory is Stefan Halper. And what he's there to do is to be a third party that just happens to mention this and can be a data point to trace back to for an FBI investigation. And so what he did was he met with Papadopoulos in London and said, so George, how about those emails and the Russians, just to create a verifiable point. And then there's the third part, the witness, as I call it, who in this case I believe is Alexander Downer, who is a very high-level Australian ambassador and former leader of the Australian Liberal Party. Now, what he did is he basically tied everything together. So when according to the reports, apparently Papadopoulos got blind drunk in a Kensington bar with him, apparently as strangers, and told him that the Russians have all this dirt on Hillary Clinton in the form of emails. Quite why Papadopoulos would blare this out drunkenly to somebody he's never met, especially an ambassador to the UK for Australia, is beyond me. But what we've had now is three different people. Now, all of these people have connections together to spy for hire agencies, along with CIA contacts, FBI contacts, and British intelligence, MI6. And so what I've done is I've traced how it goes from one position to another, and each person plays a specific role.
Let's move to the fact that, if this is true, this really would be as big a scandal or bigger than Watergate. But as you lay this out, and you really have to read the article to get the sense of all the players and how they interconnected. But let me play devil's advocate for a moment. Could this not have been a legitimate attempt to use intelligence assets to figure out how the Russians were tampering in the election and why it all seemed to work for the benefit of Donald Trump?
That's certainly a possibility, but it's incredibly slim because the paymasters behind this were the Democrat Party. And the target of it was Donald Trump. I mean, we haven't heard anything about the FBI happened to say, well, we also did an investigation into the DNC, and guess what? They're all clear. This hasn't happened. We haven't heard anything about that. So it couldn't have been just an attempt to use assets to figure out if the Russians were tampering in the election, because that would obviously have to come in from both sides based on what the information we've received from places like Facebook, who said that the Russian actors were attempting to disrupt both sides of the equation. But yeah, it really would be a huge scandal. It would involve two things. One is an attempt by security services to derail a candidate of for president of the United States, and then leading on to derailing a president of the United States, which is pure deep state as far as I'm concerned. But of course, there's the other aspect of it, where we know that a lot of the information, for example, the Steele dossier, was funded and used to back up what's been happening with Papadopoulos and Carter, and according to the FBI, also with the FISA warrants. And this was paid for by the Democrats, by the Hillary campaign and the DNC. So, yeah, to say it might be a legitimate attempt to use intelligence assets is kind of out of the window. It's quite unrealistic.
All right, Mark, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Tim.
Mark Angelides of LibertyNation.com. You really need to read his series to connect all the dots for yourself. It's entitled Bringing Down a President, available now at LibertyNation.com. What did Obama's CIA director know, and when did he know it? And is it time to repeal the law creating the special counsel position? We'll talk that over in just a moment.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
So as we discussed in the last segment, the band plays on. The special counsel investigation by Robert Mueller continues into a second year, with mounting questions about the legitimacy of the investigation itself and the methods used by the D.C. deep state to expose Trump to legal jeopardy. And while a couple of major Obama administration bigwigs have undergone considerable scrutiny, one particularly significant player had escaped the spotlight until recently. That would be Barack Obama's CIA director, John Brennan. But as Molly Hemingway, the excellent writer for The Federalist, said on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News this week, Brennan's day of reckoning will soon come.
We have a problem with multiple heads of intelligence agencies, and that does include Brennan, who has a history of lying specifically about spying on American citizens. But we've also had problems with falsehoods being said also by James Clapper, who gave inconsistent testimony about his leaking to the media. But one of the things that's interesting is Clapper and Comey have been so much a part of this story, and we've seen their names a great deal. But Brennan has been able to kind of stay out of the limelight until recently, where people are starting to piece together just how integral he was to the entire Russia narrative.
So what lies that Molly Hemingway referred to has Brennan told? Well, here he is testifying before the House Intelligence Committee.
Do you know who commissioned the Steele dossier?
I don't.
Did the CIA rely on it?
No.
Why not?
Because we didn't. It wasn't part of the corpus of intelligence information that we had. It was not in any way used as a basis for the intelligence community assessment that was done.
Well, we now know that all of those statements are lies, that Brennan signed off on the application for a FISA warrant, which was used as the basis for the investigation. And yet here he was, the director of the world's top intelligence agency, using the Sergeant Schultz defense, claiming that he knew nothing about the source of the Steele dossier and that the dossier was not used by the intelligence agencies. And Brennan has hardly helped his own cause by going on MSNBC and revealing his partisan hand when it comes to the 45th president, spouting the leftist talking point that Trump has reversed so much of the Obama legacy simply to make a point, as he did in scrubbing the Iran nuclear deal.
He was trashing it and discarding it simply because he promised during the campaign he would do so, and because it was his predecessor who did it. And so everything that came before Trump, in his view, is wrong. And so that just...
By every president.
By every president. It just reflects his arrogance, his self-promotion.
Imagine that. Trump canceled the Iran deal because he promised to do so during the presidential campaign. Only in Washington could people find it weird for a candidate to make a campaign promise and then actually keep it. The Democrats are slowly and understandably starting to distance themselves from the special counsel investigation. Witness longtime Democrat pollster and advisor to President Bill Clinton, Mark Penn, who lived through the special counsel investigation by Ken Starr that started with a land deal, Whitewater, and ended up with Monica Lewinsky having sex with the president in the White House.
I spent a year fighting Ken Starr and saw on the inside how these investigations affect people trying to do their job in the White House or in political campaigns or in our democracy. Unless there is something really incredibly significant there, to continue and drag this on drags down the ability for people to do their job for this country. And you look at this thing, the origins of this thing have been suspect from the beginning. The Steele dossier, the Papadopoulos meeting, the Australian who may have been connected to the Clinton Foundation. This whole thing has been the fruits of a poisonous tree. What was originally sought after wasn't found. This is now 1998 all over again with an investigation somehow related to a porn star.
The fruits of a poisonous tree. And again, that was a lifelong Democrat and top advisor to Bill Clinton. So how do we end these kind of investigations where a special counsel or special prosecutor is given carte blanche to go after anything he chooses, where Whitewater turns into Monica Lewinsky, where Russian interference in the election turns into Stormy Daniels? Well, that law that allows this was passed 40 years ago. 1978, and the Democrat majority in Congress was determined to curb the powers of the president and other executive branch officials in the fallout from the Watergate scandal and the so-called Saturday Night Massacre when President Nixon fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. which led to his resignation. The Democrats passed the Ethics in Government Act, creating a special prosecutor position, later called the special counsel, which could be used by Congress or the Attorney General to conduct the type of investigations we've now seen on the Clinton, Bush 43, and Trump administrations. They're given an incredibly long leash to investigate allegations of any misconduct with an unlimited budget and no deadline, and can be dismissed only by the Attorney General for what they call good cause. Now, many leading voices, like, for example, the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, argued that this independent counsel's office was a sort of fourth branch of government that had virtually unlimited powers and was answerable to no one. However, the constitutionality of the new office was ultimately upheld in a 1988 Supreme Court decision, Morrison versus Olson. Now, no matter which side you're on, is it not time to reconsider what many people believe to be an unconstitutional law, an unconstitutional grant of authority to special counsels with few, if any, boundaries or limitations, where the whole job of the special counsel is to find crimes, even if none have been alleged, as in this case? You need to remember that Mueller was empowered to conduct a counterintelligence investigation related to national security issues. But oh so predictably, it has now all the earmarks of a criminal investigation with no end yet in sight. At Liberty Nation, we never stop trying to make things more convenient for our busy audience. That's why we've developed a new, faster, and more intuitive app. Simply download the LibertyNation.com app from Apple iTunes or the Google Play Store. Liberty Nation stays on top of the latest news and developments, and now you can too. Next up, the Supreme Court passes down a bunch of rulings, including a big one that will effectively legalize sports gambling across the nation. We'll talk it all over with LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we welcome you into the portion of Liberty Nation Radio, which we entitle Talkin' Liberty, where we discuss and break down various constitutional issues in the news, or in many cases, stuff that should be in the news but isn't, as we're joined by LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, our regular contributor and constitutional lawyer, Scott Cosenza, the man with the longest title in the world. But we have a lot in the legal world these days, Scott. And let's start. We're going to get to the Supreme Court and a bunch of decisions from them, including gambling. But first, Robert Mueller will adhere to the Justice Department's view that the Constitution bars prosecuting sitting presidents, at least according to President Trump's legal team. Do we know this to be true, that we're certain that this president will not be
Speculation,
indicted?
Tim, is the appropriate then default position for this sort of thing, right? To analyze it. I read one piece on it in its entirety. It was the New York Times treatment of the story, and it seemed pretty convincing to me. In a meeting with Robert Mueller's lawyers, his team, Mr. Giuliani, and members of Mr. Trump's team, said that there was some confusion about whether or not the president could be indictable or not. And it was the position of the Trump team that DOJ guidelines prohibit even going out to an attempt to indict the president, and because it's legally impermissible. They followed up that meeting and got a phone call from Mueller's team that said, we agree, the DOJ guidelines are, are clear and convincing, basically. The law is, or the rules are, and we will not pursue an indictment against President Trump. So I think it's pretty huge news.
What's the constitutional analysis on this? I mean, because you're saying it's a Department of Justice rule, regulation, whatever, but the Constitution must have something to say about whether a president can be indicted or not while he's president. And the second part of that is he can then be indicted once he leaves office for crimes that were committed before or during his term as president, yes?
You're right to say this is just this is not some law, some federal law that they've talked about. This is their guidelines, but their guidelines are based on their reading of the Constitution. And it was that same judgment and reading that happened against Nixon and Clinton. And it's appropriate that, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I don't have a constitutional opinion on it myself. Except to say that it's better when the branches do not clash in ways that the Constitution did not foresee, because that makes for some troublesome outcomes.
It appears that this whole investigation was all about finding impeachable charges, not prosecutable charges necessarily so much as impeachable charges in terms of Trump. Would you agree with that? I mean, that's a political process.
Well, here's why I might disagree. I don't know exactly how I feel about that point, but I would say that Mr. Cohen's conduct, what we know about him perhaps selling, access, at least to himself, if not to the President of the United States, that could yield impeachable conduct. But Mueller didn't keep that case for himself. He passed that on to Central Justice, who then put it, I think, to the First District in New York. So it seems like he may actually be being true to his grant of authority to investigate and prosecute only this quote-unquote collusion or intelligence matters. So we'll see. I mean, it's one of those things, Tim, where the books are going to, for 20 years, are going to be reading, insiders' accounts of what happened here. And, it's fascinating stuff.
I guess the only question will be how much of it will actually be true and how much of it will be conspiracy theory. Because, boy, I'll tell you, if ever there was an investigation that's ripe for conspiracy theory, it is this. And with that, let's move into the Supreme Court, because the Supremes, and I don't mean the version with Diana Ross, were very busy. And, of course, at the top of the list was a decision that will open the floodgates for states to legalize gambling, states other than Nevada and New Jersey.
Well, New Jersey did not have legalized sports betting. This case allows them to do it. So Congress passed this law that basically was designed to prevent the sports gambling from spreading in the United States. It's called the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act in 92. If Jersey wanted gambling, they had to act within a year of its passage to pass gambling. And there were some other little state lottery things that were involved, but that's kind of a side issue. Jersey didn't pass the law. Fast forward to 2012, I think it was, Christie signed a sports gambling law for New Jersey, and PAPSA allowed third parties to come in and sue for enforcement of the law. That's how it was designed. So it's
PAPSA?
That's the law, the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, the one that was passed in 92.
Okay.
So it's not like the Justice Department came in and said, Jersey, you can't do this. The NCAA came in, which was authorized under that law, these third-party interveners. That's sort of, I would think that's why the law got passed, to satisfy those groups. Anyway, Jersey said, hey, this is not okay. You have now commandeered our legislature by authorizing this type of law that prevents us from legalizing, basically, gambling. Again, they didn't enact a federal prohibition on the acts of gambling, because that would then, you couldn't differentiate Nevada from it. And that's basically how they got it passed. Nevada was never going to okay giving up the sports book. It's a huge, huge moneymaker for them. So anyway, the Supreme Court basically rules, yep, you're right. This is commandeering. It can't happen. So right now, there's no prohibition on any new state, coming into the legalized sports gambling arena. And Jersey, Tim, I think is going to be first on the blocks. They're the ones who sued here. They have the infrastructure with their current casinos. We're going to see legalized sports betting, I think, in gambling in New Jersey ASAP.
Boy, Chris Christie, the former governor, was like a dog on a bone about this. This was a huge issue for him, and he fought it tooth and nail. And it seems unusual for people that know New Jersey. They think of Atlantic City, and they think that, well, in Vegas you can gamble on sports, so you probably can in Atlantic City too. You can't, but now this will create some equivalence. It will help to level the playing field between the fading casinos of Atlantic City. Now, there was a case called McCoy versus Louisiana. What I found interesting about this, Scott, was that, we've seen many cases where the defendant will plead a temporary insanity or insanity outright, so that he wasn't he wasn't aware or couldn't really comprehend the nature of his actions.
Couldn't form the mens rea required.
Thank you for
or
that.
State of mind.
Thank
to
you.
Complete the crime.
However, I've never seen a case where the defendant's attorneys argue that because his mental state was such that he couldn't even form the legal intent to commit a crime.
Well, that's a fairly common argument made on behalf of defendants. What's uncommon, and then what happened in this case, is they did so over the defendant's objections. So the lawyers say, hey, we're going to try to keep you off of death row here. We've got, the evidence against your guilt is overwhelming. They're going to find you guilty. Okay, you killed these 3 people. We know it. Everybody knows it. It's a pipe dream to suggest you're going to walk out of this courtroom a free man. Let's keep you off of death row. We'll argue that, essentially you were crazy and didn't have the ability to commit, the intent element of first-degree murder, right? To meet a first-degree murder conviction, it's a very specific thing that you have to meet each element of the crime. It's not just that you took a life. Specifically, intent, it matters, and some other requirements matter as well. So he says, absolutely not. I wasn't even in the state at the time. It's a conspiracy of cops and whatever to do it. Which, by the way, based on the evidence that I've seen, sounds perfectly ludicrous. The trial court ruled that the man's attorneys, over his objections, could make those arguments to the jury. That they didn't have to portray his innocence. They could argue to try to keep him off death row that he did it, but didn't have a guilty mind that the law requires. The Supreme Court ruled that he gets a new trial, that he gets to determine, because admitting to the actual killings was an element of the crime, that he had the right to control that aspect of his defense. So he gets a new trial. And I think it's good for defendants to have more power rather than to give that power to judges in the state. I call it a win for liberty.
Okay, Scott, the other case, or another case of note, was Byrd versus the United States.
Tim, in Byrd versus the United States, this guy was driving in Pennsylvania in a rental car. He didn't rent the car. Another person did, but he had permission from that person to operate the car. Cops pulled him over because he wasn't a rental car, actually. They were profiling him. And guess what? They were right. He had, I think it was 50 keys of heroin in the trunk, or 50 bricks maybe. In any case, they searched his car, though, because he wasn't listed on the rental agreement. And they claimed that he had no reasonable expectation of privacy because he wasn't listed on the agreement. It was pretty outrageous, I think. The court unanimously disagreed with this interpretation that basically they could treat a person like they stolen a car because their name wasn't listed on the rental agreement. Nobody's arguing, by the way, that Enterprise isn't entitled to whatever damages they may recover from the person who actually rented the car for giving it to somebody in violation of the rental agreement.
Enterprise will pick you up.
But the police are not supposed to be the Enterprise police, right? They're supposed to be the police under the Constitution of the United States and of Pennsylvania in this case. So I think it's a great ruling on behalf of the Supreme Court that they rejected once again the government, and this was the Obama, Tim, and Trump Justice Departments trying to restrict our freedoms with a big power grab.
All right. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Tim.
And if you want to know more about the decisions passed down by the Supreme Court this week, we discuss it at length in our podcast, The Uprising, available to you, along with this program, Liberty Nation Radio, at LibertyNation.com, and, of course, from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we will be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation.